I think we're already in World War III. It's just like the way we understand war is different in the 21st century than in the 20th century. So 19th century war was essentially about armies clashing on the battlefield. Like World War I was just trench warfare. It was easy to see as war because these armies were just killing each other on the trenches. World War II was about destroying the state's capacity to fight the war. So basically targeting civilian populations. So for example, the fire bombings of Germany and Japan were what allowed the Allies to win the war in the end. That's the 20th century warfare. 21st century warfare is different in that it's ultimately about economic strangulation and forcing your opponent to submit and causing domestic unrest. And I think World War III, the two main combatants are America and Russia. And already we're seeing this massive war in the oceans where American ships are trying to target and board, basically seize, Russian shadow fleet tankers. These are just acts of piracy. And so I believe that in the future, what's going to happen is that the Russians are going to arm and militarize their shadow fleet. And so we should see a massive war in the oceans in the next few years. So this war is primarily economically between Russia and America. Another aspect of this war is sabotage, right? So we're seeing these Ukrainian drones striking at Russian oil refineries. We're seeing oil refineries being shot all around the world. So basically, it's economic warfare. It's economic strangulation. Now, China is key to this because the American strategy vis-a-vis China is different from the American strategy vis-a-vis Russia. So America just wants to destroy Russia economically. But actually, China is very important for America to maintain its debt financing. So right now, America has about $39 trillion in debt, and it needs China to continue to buy US treasuries. So America is trying to create a situation in which China is forced to buy US treasuries and allow America to maintain the Ponzi scheme. And so it doesn't want to destroy China economically, because if you destroy China economically, then China is just going to choose a nuclear option and offload all its US treasuries, causing a panic in the global economy. So what America wants to do is basically try to pressure China into an economic settlement. And so if you look at what happened in Venezuela, so under Third, America kidnapped Maduro. And you can make the argument that the entire point of that was to signal to China that America controls the Western Hemisphere. This is something called the Don Monroe Doctrine, or the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And China has invested trillions of dollars into South American infrastructure, ports, refineries, railways, because China needs the food, resources, and energy from South America. So what Trump is trying to say to China is that if you want to buy anything from in North America, you have to go through us. We will collect a tax. And the tax is for you to open up your financial market and for us to be able to sell stable coins to your population. Okay, so stable coins are just digital currency backed by US treasuries. So the entire strategy is institutions buy US treasuries and then individuals can buy US stable coins. And so the United States is invested in having the Chinese economy do well and in forcing Chinese to buy more US treasuries and more US dollars in order to sustain the US economy. And that's the strategy for Americans going into next 5 years. And there will be 3 areas to look out for, I think, in these negotiations. And these negotiations will take over the course of next year. The first is trade. And again, I think what's going to happen is that China will agree to buy more resources from the Western Hemisphere, specifically LNG from America, in order to sustain its manufacturing sector. Second issue is Taiwan, where in order to better facilitate trade between the United States and China, Trump is going to declare that Taiwan and China are the same political entity. He's going to refute Taiwanese independence. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is that I think you will see massive cooperation in AI, where both nations agree that AI is the future, and they will agree to share technology and cooperation in developing AI that is safe and effective for the entire human race. And again, the entire goal of the United States is to turn China into an economic vassal of the American empire. Well, unfortunately, the European leadership has already been vassalized, right? So you go back to 2022, when the war between Ukraine and Russia started, the Europeans froze $200 billion of Russian assets at the bequest of Americans. This destroyed legitimacy, credibility of the European banking system. The Europeans stopped buying Russian energy, and this destroyed the European economy. The Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed, and the Europeans knew who did it. Everyone knows who did it, but they insisted it was the Russians who did it. So in many respects, the Europeans have already been vassalized. And now the Europeans are already discussing drafting men to go fight in Ukraine. If the Europeans did not provide the financing and the political support to the Ukrainians, this war would have been over 2 years ago. So unfortunately, the European leadership has already been vassalized. And this is going to create a lot of discontent within the European population. We're already seeing that with the rise of the AfD in Germany. What people don't appreciate is that the United States is in a lot of financial trouble. So right now, the United States has $39 trillion in debt. And so they're forced to spend $1 to $2 trillion in financing this debt, paying interest to this debt. And there are no good options here. If you default, what happens is that you cause private banks that are financing the US government right now, the Federal Reserve basically, to collapse. In which case, all these savings that these Americans have put into the banks are wiped out. So default is not an option. So your only option is war. And the idea of war is to force other parties to pay and absorb the US debt. So when you go into Iran, what you're trying to do is you're trying to cause economic strangulation throughout the world. The Europeans are very dependent on Middle East oil. If the Europeans cannot pay for Middle East oil, they're now forced to pay more for American oil. Right? So American LNG costs 50 times more than Russian energy. So what America wants to do is force the entire world to buy US energy and resources from the Western Hemisphere. And the US will finance this, meaning that the United States will lend the world the money to buy US weapons and US resources. This is very similar to the early 20th century because Europe was in World War II and World War I. America was able to sell its resources around the world and make a lot of money for itself. And you're right in that the Iranians are fighting very hard because it's their home. And Americans are also forced to fight very hard as well because the alternative is economic collapse, civil war, and possibly the collapse of the American state. So the calculus is that if you do nothing, you might have a situation like the 1848 revolutions, when all the monarchies in Europe in 1848 were at the precipice of being overthrown by popular rebellions. And if you do something, you might end up in World War I, where millions of people just died in the trenches, and it seemed as though the world was about to end. So if you're the elite in Europe and America, you would much prefer the World War I option as opposed to the 1848 option. And that's a stark choice facing the global elite right now. You either do nothing, and then your populations revolt against you because you're incompetent, you're greedy, you're corrupt, or you send them to die off in the trenches of Ukraine to send them to die in the mountains of Iran in order to reduce the political tension at home. I know this is very blunt, and I know this is very stark, but at the end of the day, the elite have dug themselves a huge hole. I think in the first month of this war, the United States was focused on decapitation, basically trying to kill as much of the Iranian nation as possible, hoping that that would force global settlement where the Iranians would surrender and the Americans can basically enforce regime change. The Iranians have proven to be much more resilient, much more resourceful than Americans gave them credit for. And so now the Americans have moved to phase 2 of the war, which is essentially a war of attrition. Economic strangulation, where they are trying to destroy Iran's capacity to finance this war, mainly by destroying Iran's capacity to export oil to China, as well as control the Strait of Hormuz. That's where Trump has declared a naval blockade against the Strait of Hormuz. And so I think that this is where the war is going to go. It's going to be a slow war that's going to be out of the headlines. And that's what Trump, I think, intends to do with Iran, where he's going to try to apply as much military, diplomatic, political, and economic pressure as possible to force a political settlement and trying to divert people's attention away from the war. Quite honestly, I don't think there is an off-ramp for Trump because the consequences of this war are just so vast. So, for example, if you look at the GCC nations, the UAE has suffered a great deal in this war. They cannot afford for Iran to emerge the victor in this war and to control the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia and Iran have a rivalry going back decades, where both are vying for supremacy in the Islamic world. And so Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a long-term threat as well. So even though Saudi Arabia has been trying to promote a diplomatic solution, their best interest is to also see a defeated Iran.
Bahrain is right now under a lot of threat, and their leadership is not very popular there. And the Iranians are very much intent on promoting revolutions across the Islamic world. So these three nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain, possibly also Kuwait as well, they want to see this war fought to the end. The Iranians don't want to go back to the status quo where they were sanctioned. They now have control of the Strait of Hormuz. They want economic relief. They see the Strait of Hormuz as their main leverage point against the Americans. So they also want to see this war fought to the end. The Americans are stuck because of the petrodollar, where if they leave, basically these GCC nations would start trading in multiple currencies, including Chinese yuan, including in gold. And so this would collapse the American economy because they're so dependent on investment from the GCC nations. The GCC has trillions invested in America, and they're forced to repatriate these trillions back into the GCC in order to pay reparations to the Iranians. Then this would spark a catastrophe for the American economy, especially AI sector. Israel is intent on the Greater Israel Project, and they see this as an opportunity to redraw the map of the Middle East in order to achieve the Greater Israel Project. Israel wants this war to continue for as long as possible because they believe that the Arabs and Iranians would destroy each other in a process. And when the smoke clears, then they would have achieved the Greater Israel Project. So essentially in the Middle East, there are too many powerful individuals who want to see this war fought to the end, and no one can really countenance a defeat.